Welcome to Echoes of History, a Ubisoft podcast brought to you by History Hit. This is the place to explore the rich stories from the past that bring the world of Assassin's Creed to life. I'm Matt Lewis. Join me as we venture into the heart of an era that has shaped legends. Assassin's Creed Shadows takes place in 1579 in medieval Japan. It's a seminal period in Japanese history, renowned for its samurai and shinobi, or as we perhaps know them better, ninja. It's a time rich in history, culture and stories, so I wanted to spend some time exploring the culture of Sengoku Japan by speaking to experts from across the globe. We'll navigate the intricate landscapes of power and ambition which you'll be able to explore in Assassin's Creed Shadows and discover how Imperial culture reacted to European influence and an independent republic of sorts within its own borders. In this episode, Lesley Downer will take us back to medieval Kyoto, the home of the Emperor. Professor Frederik Cryns will reveal the impact of Portuguese missionaries on the religion and politics of Japan. And Nate Ledbetter from Princeton University will recount the dramatic events of the Tensho-Iga War, when samurai met shinobi in battle. Let's dive into the echoes of history. Hi Lesley, thank you so much for joining us on Echoes of History.
Thank you, Matt. Very pleased to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. So we're talking today about the city of Kyoto, which most people will think of Tokyo as the capital of Japan, but Kyoto was a very important city in the periods that we're talking about. So in terms of geography, whereabouts in Japan is Kyoto?
So Kyoto is the absolute heart of Japan. It's exactly in the middle, and it's perfectly placed to be the capital city, which is what it was for 1,000 years. It's the most auspicious place. It's the Chinese rules of geomancy, the Chinese rules of feng shui. It's got mountains behind it on three sides. It's got the sea in front. It's got two rivers running through. It fulfills all the necessary requirements of feng shui to be the perfect place for a capital. So Tokyo has been the capital for about less than 200 years. It's central, so therefore you can get down to the south to Kyushu, you can get up to the north, which when the city was founded was where the wild tribesmen, the so-called wild tribesmen of the north were, whom the Japanese of that time wanted to conquer. So it's centrally located, it has roads branching out in every direction. Also, it has rivers, which is useful for carrying goods to and forth. Also, the mountains provide protection from three sides. In terms of climate, it's not so ideal. It's called a bonchi because it's like a basin, and it collects the heat and the humidity in that low kind of circle of land that it lies on. So it's quite hot, quite steamy. You can see the mountains. It's very beautiful.
So when does Kyoto begin to rise to importance in Japanese history? When does it emerge as the capital city?
It didn't emerge, it was created as capital city. Emperor Kamu, who was the greatest emperor in Japanese history, he was the Charlemagne of Japan. He was the only emperor that really wielded a lot of power. After him, emperors stopped wielding power. And before his time, the capital had been in Nara, but it was kind of taken over by the Buddhist priests. And there were all sorts of kind of scandals to do with these Buddhist clergy. So he then was in 794 on a supposed hunting trip with his geomancers to find the perfect place. And so he settled on Kyoto as the place to be his capital. The name Kyoto means capital city. Kyo is the capital and To is city.
And does Kyoto also, at the same time or later, does it emerge as a spiritual centre for Japan too?
Different sects of Buddhism arrived in Japan at different times. And the first sect grew up in Nara, as I said, and caused trouble. And that stayed in Nara. The whole point was to leave those priests behind in Nara and move to Kyoto. Other sects then grew up. A lot grew up at the time of warrior rule. They grew up in Kamakura, not in Kyoto, including the Zen sect, which became very dominant, particularly because it was the chosen sect of the warrior class. Its kind of ethics, its mode of being, its simplicity, its asceticism, its kind of purity, its lack of words made it appeal very much to the warrior class. So if you go to Kyoto, it's absolutely full of Zen temples. That sort of approach appealed very much to the samurai, who were very pure and direct in their attitude to life. The samurai weren't particularly about violence. Violence was sort of incidental. It was about how to lead a very direct and pure life. And the other side is the Shinto side, which is to this day colourful and wild and crazy, and there are huge carnivals with men in loincloths, I'm using the present tense here, carrying shrines, carrying the Shinto gods on their shoulders, dancing through the streets of Kyoto and every other Japanese city, drinking lots of sake. That goes on, and Zen goes on, and that's a side that Westerners tend not to quite so much identify with Japan, and that relates to a figure we're going to come to in a while, I suspect, which is Hideyoshi. So there's the flamboyant side of Japan and there's the aesthetic side of Japan.
So how then is Kyoto affected by the Sengoku period as we move into this period of fracturing and then towards the reunification of Japan? Does Kyoto remain important even as power is dispersed more widely across Japan?
The Sengoku period, which is the period of incredible warfare, which was completely bonkers warfare. I mean, it was a couple of different lords who really hated each other. There was a whole excuse for it, but the excuse is kind of irrelevant. It's said that they destroyed the whole of Kyoto. That's not quite true. They destroyed the upper class part of Kyoto. So 10 years of fighting included looting, arson, and all these other things. But this mainly happened, this was the temples, this was the palaces, that lot got destroyed. Meanwhile, the shogun who lived at that point was a guy called Yoshimasa. He was very interested in the arts, and he was not remotely interested in fighting, and he kept well out of this fighting, and he went off to the east of the city, and there he built a fabulous pavilion, the Silver Pavilion, and there he carried on having a life of leisure and art with his friends. While all this was going on in Kyoto, his pavilion was facing away from the city, so he didn't have to see it was burning, and it was facing towards the lovely mountains on the east. And he was, again, an amazing patron of the arts, and under him ink painting flourished, pottery flourished, every possible art form. Linked verse became very important. The part of the city that had not burnt down was the part where the merchants and the artisans were, because they were poor chaps, and so nobody bothered with looting them. But they weren't that poor, so they were actually supplying and selling stuff to both sides in this war and getting richer. So the war came to an end. Everything had sort of fallen apart. The result of that was that a lot of the lords headed out to the provinces, partly because they were broke, because they'd had their houses burnt down. Meantime, quite a lot of peasants and serfs could kind of come out of the countryside into the city and recreate themselves as merchants or as artisans, because they could make things, they could sell things. And so a whole new culture, in fact a really fantastic and flamboyant culture, arose from that period of disaster.
How does Kyoto become involved then in the reunification of Japan? Is it still somewhere that people focus on as the capital? If you want to control Japan, you have to control Kyoto.
It was the capital. It was the capital. So the first great unifier who eventually started bringing stuff together was Oda Nobunaga, who was a really amazing figure, and through brilliant warfare managed to take more and more land, and with each land his army grew bigger and bigger, and eventually he was definitely the most powerful person in the land. And he also gave himself legitimacy as a ruler by helping out the emperor. So the emperor was still rather broke. The emperor throughout centuries was very often very poor, and very often just basically getting pocket money from whoever was in power. And Francis Xavier the Jesuit priest, showed up in Japan at that time. And his theory was, I will go to Kyoto, I will convert the emperor to Catholicism, and then everybody else in the whole country will follow him. And he got to Kyoto. It was a complete wreck. It was sort of a burnt-out ruin. He couldn't find the emperor, so he gave up.
Yeah, so aside from the damage done to Kyoto, political fracturing of Japan and then it's coming back together doesn't really impact Kyoto's position and power.
No. Also, Japan, unlike England, is a country of, up to that point, mainly wooden buildings, and a country of lots of earthquakes. So people are used to everything falling down, and they're used to everything going on fire because that happens in earthquakes, and they're used to rebuilding. So it didn't take as long as it would have taken to rebuild London, to rebuild Kyoto. It didn't take that long. So Kyoto was back on its feet quite quickly. But Kyoto was the capital, and that was that. And so each of these unifiers, the first being Nobunaga, first of all established themselves in Kyoto. And his trusted lieutenant, who was a guy called Hashiba Hideyoshi. Hashiba Hideyoshi had a lot of different names. He started off the son of a farmer, and he was called Hiyoshi. And he was also called Saru-san, which means Mr. Monkey, because he was an ugly bloke and looked like a monkey. And he was small and ugly. He had a lot of girlfriends. He had a really devoted wife to whom he wrote wonderful letters. This is all by the by. Hideyoshi is a great guy. And basically, Nobunaga's method had been force and violence. Hideyoshi was the man with the golden tongue. He used persuasion, he was nice to people, and he got everybody to pledge allegiance to him. And then, so there's this period of 30 years between when Nobunaga walks into Kyoto, which is in 1568, and Hideyoshi's death in 1598. That 30 years was an unbelievable period of glory. Because Hideyoshi came from a poor family, he was a farmer's son, and he had climbed his way right through the ranks, which only 2 people in the whole of Japanese history did. He sort of didn't have anything to prove to anybody. He was very nice to the emperor. You know, he loved culture. He wanted to enjoy all those wonderful things that the upper classes had. He liked show, he liked display, he liked sort of flamboyancy. For example, there are paintings of the wonderful kimonos people wore. And there are also beautiful paintings of how Kyoto looked, with all the people on the streets, people dancing, the beautiful buildings, the temples, the palaces. He built a palace in the middle called Jurakudai, in the middle of Kyoto, where Nijo Castle is now, for those of you who've been there, anyone who's been there, right in the centre. And then he also built Momoyama Castle in the south of Kyoto, and he also, while he was at it, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question anymore, but he also, while he was at it, he had an enormous tea party for the entire population of Kyoto, the entire population, including all the poor people, and got them all to come. And it occupied a whole sort of enormous shrine grounds, and I think there was something like 800 tea pavilions there. And part of tea is displaying your beautiful utensils, and he displayed his gold utensils. And he also had an entire tea hut made of gold, which is sort of ironic, because the whole point of tea is that it is, it is poor, and it is aged, and it is austere, and it is all those things. But he did the reverse.
Bringing a bit of bling to the tea ceremony. You mentioned then that there were some illustrations of Kyoto. Do we have a good idea of what Kyoto may have looked like in its heyday?
I mean, we know what it looked like in Emperor Kamu's time when it was founded. I think for some reason we know that better than we do how it looked in Hideyoshi's day, but it looked quite similar. So it was laid out in a grid plan, like a chessboard, with equal-sized square areas. And then it had long kind of boulevards going down the middle. It had small lanes going off to the sides. It had the emperor's palace up at the top with beautiful kind of green roofs, red columns, very spectacular. You could see the emperor's palace wherever you were. And along these boulevards, people trundled in ox-drawn carriages. Ladies were hidden, but when they trundled up and down in ox-drawn carriages, they'd always let a bit of their brocade robe sort of flow out of the window so that people would know there was somebody really special inside. That was Kyoto in that heyday, which is around like the 9th, 10th centuries. If we kind of sweep past all these other wonderful periods and we get up to the time of Hideyoshi sort of had it basically laid out Kyoto as it is now. He cut those squares in half, so you have rectangular blocks rather than square blocks. He also built a wall around the outside of the city, which isn't there anymore, but he had that built. He also built these glorious palaces. So you would have very glorious palaces on the main boulevards, and you'd also have glorious temples, which are not radically different in appearance from glorious palaces. And then you'd have the whole merchants' area, which would be tiny little lanes of small dark houses with bamboo blinds, which still exist. And then from the streets of Kyoto you could see the mountains to the east, which is where Yoshimasa was looking when Kyoto was burning down behind him. You could see the mountains to the north. You could see the mountain to the northwest, which is always the unlucky direction, where there was a temple, a huge complex of temples on the top, and still is. And you could also see Arashiyama to the west, which is where the Flying Dragon Temple was, and lots of other beautiful temples and bamboo groves. So you always could see those all around. You can to this day. So Hideyoshi laid out Kyoto as it is now, basically. And the street plan is still the same as Hideyoshi laid it out.
It sounds like an absolutely glorious place. What kind of people would have lived there? Presumably you've got all of the nobility living in their big palaces, but would there have been other walks of life in different parts of Kyoto that were perhaps a little less auspicious?
Yeah, starting at the top, you'd have the emperor there, you'd have his courtiers there, you'd have warriors, lots of warriors who'd also live in sort of fairly fabulous villas. You'd also have lots of monks and priests all living in there's loads of unbelievable number of temples, and I mean uncountable number of temples and monasteries in Kyoto, and sub-temples. So there'd be loads of monks living in those places. Then you have down one side of the city is the River Kamo, which is, you've got the River Kamo dividing the city from the eastern mountains. And at the foot of the eastern mountains is an area of flat land, which became a big area of carnival. So if you wanted to have fun, you go there. So when you're having a respectable life and your wife and your family and everything else are there, you stay away from the mountains. But you could also cross the bridge to this area of carnival where there would be sumo wrestling, there'd be jugglers, there'd be theatre, and there would be ladies of pleasure, lots of ladies of pleasure. And at various times, within Hideyoshi's reign, a particular man whose name was Saburoemon Hara, he said to Hideyoshi, why don't I gather together these ladies of pleasure who are a little bit chaotic, because it's good to have a bit of order. There's no issue with morality about this. It's to do with orderliness. And so he gathered them into particular places which became pleasure quarters. The theatre people and denizens of the pleasure quarters were considered the lowest of the low, on the one hand, but on the other hand, they were kind of celebs. So when you see woodblock prints, a lot of those are of courtesans and they're of theatre people. Those were like pin-up posters. So that would be the fun part of the city. And in 1603, which is just after Hideyoshi's time, there was a woman called Izumo no Okuni, who was a shrine maiden and prostitute, and she thought of a fabulous way of advertising her wares, which was to dance on a stage. Usually she cross-dressed, she dressed like a man with swords, and she did very funny skits, and loads of people came to watch her perform, and then so that gave a lot of customers for afterwards, and that was the beginning of what became known as the geisha and the courtesan. So everything was kind of people. Of course, people like that had always been around, but this was a kind of coalescing of it. Which brings me to the other people I forgot about, which is of course the Portuguese. So the Portuguese were there in Hideyoshi's time. In fact, they got there before Hideyoshi's time. They got there in about 1535, and there was a whole kind of a sort of seasoning of Japanese culture with Portuguese stuff. The dishes like tempura came from Portuguese cuisine, which was called tempura because the Portuguese used to eat fried foods on certain holy days called a tempura. And Hideyoshi enjoyed wearing Portuguese clothes. In fact, lots of it was a real hot thing among the Japanese nobles, was wearing Portuguese clothes. You're wearing a cross. It didn't mean anything. It was like they were fashion victims, but they thought this is really great. And so there were also, when you see pictures of Okuni dancing, there were Portuguese there watching her as well. There was also the Portuguese around Oda Nobunaga. There were some that knew him very well, and he liked them. He thought he had no interest in Christianity, but he just thought these are clever men. They're kind of fanatical like him, so he liked them. So there's that whole flavour of the Portuguese around the place as well.
I guess it's not a spoiler. We mentioned it a little bit earlier that Kyoto isn't the capital of Japan anymore. Does Kyoto then have a kind of fall? Why does the capital move away from there at some point?
After Hideyoshi's death, he wanted his son Hideyori to succeed him. That didn't work out. There was a huge battle in Sekigahara in 1603, and Tokugawa Ieyasu won, and he finally properly unified Japan and brought it to peace. He gave Japan 250 years of peace, which was a phenomenal time, an incredible sort of development of culture. At the beginning of this period is 1603, the battle. The end of this period is 1868. And in that 250 years, Japan changed completely and became close to becoming the modern place it is now. In that 250 years, the official capital was Kyoto, but the Tokugawa city was Edo. So the centre of policy, the centre of government, the centre of culture, more and more gravitated towards Edo. And in 1868, the then emperor, who was 14, I think, or 16, he was a teenager, didn't march, he was carried by palanquin, topped with a phoenix, up to Edo and into Edo Castle, which became the Imperial Palace, and Edo became Tokyo, which is the eastern capital. So, therefore, Kyoto was no longer the capital at all. So there was a kind of time of being a bit depressed. I think the people of Kyoto were a bit depressed, particularly because the emperor was the heart of their whole city, and then he'd gone. So Kyoto did have its kind of down moment, and then the people of Kyoto decided they had to do something about this. What they realised was that Kyoto was still the cultural centre. So Kyoto sort of somehow had a resurgence. It was also the centre of the geisha, which is quite important, actually. It recreated itself as a centre of traditional culture. So it has maintained its kind of aura of being somewhere classy, somewhere creative. Yeah, it's the sort of emotional heart, if you like. Maybe it's the heart, and maybe Tokyo is the head or something. Very wonderful.
It sounds incredible. Both of them sound incredible in different ways. I was going to end by sort of asking you whether you would have liked to have lived in Kyoto during the Sengoku period. I'm getting a sense that I might be able to guess at your answer. Is it a place you think you would have liked to be?
When you say the Sengoku period, you see that includes the period when it got burnt down. So obviously I could have been a merchant when it got burnt down. That would be okay. I think it would have been really fun to have been there. Those 30 years between 1568 and 1598, I think that would have been an amazing time to have been in Kyoto.
Welcome to Echoes of History, Frederik. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to talk about this aspect of Japanese medieval life, and it's sort of their first real contact with Europeans. Can you tell us a little bit about when Portuguese missionaries first arrive in Japan? When does that contact begin?
Well, that begins in the middle of the 16th century, in 1549 to be correct. The Portuguese traveled to the east from the 15th century on. It was in 1542 or 43, it's still being disputed, that the first Portuguese merchants reached Japan. And at the same time, you had the Society of Jesus, which started in 1540. And soon after the papal bull was ordained, Francis Xavier, who was a Jesuit and one of the founding members of the Jesuits, he was asked to travel to Asia to begin doing missionary work there. He was asked especially by King John III of Portugal, because he was very keen on trying to get as many Asians adhering to the Christian religion. So in 1542, he came to India, but he didn't get good results. So he tried to go to Malacca, but there was not much interest for his propagating of the faith. And there he met with a Japanese called Anjiro. Probably his real name was Yajiro. He told him about Japan, and also some Portuguese merchants who had gone to Japan told him that that will be the country where you really are going to get a lot of people converted to Christianity. And in 1549, he finally set foot on Japan.
So the initial contact is really about merchants looking for places to trade, but it very quickly turns into a religious mission. And there seems to be an element there that Japan was identified as somewhere that might be sort of ripe for Christianization, that there might be a will there to be converted to Christianity, which would have been a draw, presumably, for the Jesuits.
Yes, so the Jesuits thought, and it was true, of course, that the Japanese were very intellectual people. When he came in Japan, he first thought that the Japanese religion, which was Buddhism, was a kind of a Christianity, because the Jesuits and the Europeans thought that in earlier times, Prester John and all those people went to Asia and established Christianity there. He met people from the Shingon sect, which is a Buddhist sect, which adhered to Dainichi Nyorai, which is a cosmic sort of Buddha. So Xavier himself preached Christianity and talked about the Christian God as Dainichi. Of course, after time, he found out that this was not Christianity at all, but still he found a lot of similarities with Buddhism.
Interesting. So their understanding of Buddhism made it feel like it would be an easy move to Christianity that might be quite an easy sell after failing in India.
Yes.
So how did those first kind of encounters between the Japanese people and the Portuguese missionaries play out? Were the Japanese happy to see them? Did they welcome them?
Well, the warlords were quite happy to see them, because when Xavier came to Japan, he first landed in Kagoshima, where there was warlords called Shimazu Takahisa, and he welcomed Xavier because he thought that when he treated the Jesuits good, then the Portuguese would come with ships full of trade goods. And that's what he wanted, because Japan wasn't allowed to trade with China at the time. And China was a producer of all kinds of silk goods. And the silk goods were very in demand in Japan among the samurai class. The Portuguese were the only ones who could purchase those silk goods in China and bring them to Japan. And the warlords could make a big profit on those trades. So from a Japanese standpoint, the Jesuits brought with them the Portuguese traders, and that was the reason why they were welcomed.
It's really interesting in those early contacts how they both seem to have their own motives, and they're both willing to adapt their approaches to fit with each other. So the Japanese are willing to welcome Christians because they think it'll bring trade, and the Jesuits are willing to portray themselves as something they wouldn't normally, as wealthy men, well-dressed men, in an effort to make sure they get in with the Japanese. So there is this kind of trying to click and work together from both sides. And given that Japanese cynicism, I guess, about wanting the Christians there because it will bring trade, what do we know about what the Japanese thought of those early arrivals from Europe? What did they make of European people?
At the time, you have some words like Nambanjin, which means southern barbarians. So they saw perhaps the Portuguese more as barbarians than equals. But still, as a whole, I think they loved new things in Japan like they do now. This was a new culture presented to them. And I think they got a liking for the exotism that those Western objects brought to them. So I think they were positively disposed towards those Jesuits and Portuguese or Western culture as a whole. But you have the strange effect that when they became Christians, some of them really became very fervent Christians. So the Jesuits got a lot of influence with some warlords and also with a lot of peasants and the lower people. So they really had some success.
Did the Portuguese and that contact with Europeans bring anything to Japan that really changed Japanese society?
First of all, I think faith. The Christian religion, they converted probably 200,000 or 300,000 Japanese, which is a phenomenal figure. They also brought in firearms, which were copied right away, and which became a crucial factor in samurai warfare. Before that, you really had more one-on-one combat in the samurai with the samurai, but with the introduction of those firearms, it became more of standing armies shooting at each other from a distance. So the way of warfare of the samurai really changed a lot.
And I guess reflects the way warfare was changing in Europe at the time as well, where there was much more of a move towards the gun and away from the sword. But it's interesting that contact with the Portuguese maybe brings that to Japan at roughly the same sort of time too. And do we see many of the leading members of Japanese society, the daimyo for example, do we see them converting to Christianity? And if we do we think that's genuine conversion, or is it for political or economic purposes to attach themselves to the trade?
Well, I think you have 3 or 4 warlords in Kyushu who converted to Christianity, and some of them were very fervent Christians. For example, you had other lords who became Christian who weren't that fervent, who just wanted the trade, but some really got into it. But many didn't convert. So you had, for example, Oda Nobunaga, who was very, very positively inclined towards the Christians, but still he never adopted the Christian faith himself. You also have his successor, Hideyoshi, which also was positively inclined in the earlier years. But he didn't become a Christian. So he got more and more opposition when there became more and more Christians. When they got more and more converts, they had a lot of opposition from the Buddhist monks. And the problem really was that when they converted Christians, they began to attack the Buddhist monks and the Buddhist temples. And a lot of Buddhist temples were destroyed. Some Japanese began to dislike the Christians.
Yeah, so I guess there's an element there of the Christians being victims of their own success, because as soon as you succeed, you swell numbers, you become a political threat and a religious threat to other people, and therefore you become a target. So they almost fall into a trap of their own success.
Yes, indeed. And afterwards, the successor of Hideyoshi, which was Tokugawa Ieyasu, he forbade Christianity totally. And all influence of the Jesuits was erased very systematically from then on. So in the Edo period, the long period of Tokugawa peace, there were not much remnants of the Christian faith in Japan. You had the hidden Christians, the Kakure Christians. But apart from that, you really have, in the Edo period, many Japanese who don't know anything about the Christian faith anymore.
So it's kind of a little blip that goes away as quickly as it arrived, almost.
Yes.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk about this early contact between Europeans and Japanese people and the influence that they were both having over each other. So thank you so much for joining us, Frederik.
Yes, thank you so much.
You can listen to the full interview with Frederik about the Portuguese and Christianity in medieval Japan by clicking on the link in the description to listen to the Echoes of History podcast, or find it wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back again to Echoes of History, Nate. It's wonderful to have you back to explore another really, really exciting episode in Japanese history.
It's absolutely wonderful to be back. Thanks.
We're going to talk today about the Tensho-Iga War.
So I'll start with the name. The Tensho comes from the era name in traditional Japanese chronology of the time period. So the Tensho period lasted from 1573 to 1592. So we're at the end of the Sengoku period, where, Oda Nobunaga is in charge and extending his influence across the land. And specifically, the conflict takes place with one invasion in 1579 and then another invasion in 1581. So the years Tensho 7 and Tensho 9, according to the Japanese chronology. And Iga is a small province surrounded by mountains in central Japan. So it's just a little bit to the southeast of the capital of Kyoto. And at this time, we're at a point where Nobunaga is extending his power. He is almost, supreme, at least in central Japan, with very little opposition. But we have this one small province that is managing to, so far, escape his attentions.
So this is the fly in Nobunaga's ointment as he's trying to repair Japan.
Honestly, he didn't really, he's got they're not really necessarily a threat militarily per se to him. So for most of the time that he's establishing his hegemony, he is concentrated elsewhere. Iga at this time is ruled by an independent league, or Iki, that did not recognize any daimyo's hegemony, and had even gone so far as to expel the military governor of the province that had been appointed by the Ashikaga. So we have a case where there's this independent territory in the middle of Nobunaga's domains, and his second son, Oda Nobukatsu, was looking to kind of establish, his own reputation, spread his wings a little bit. And so here we have, Iga province next to him, a place where he can launch an invasion, take it over. It's small. How hard could it be, right? Be an easy victory. And it turns out not to be. And so, that's kind of the background.
And we've got the basis there for a great story, haven't we? We've got Oda Nobunaga, who is on the rise and is just growing and growing in power. We've got this tiny little island in the middle of all his authority that's resisting him, and we've got this son who's desperate to prove himself to his dad and thinks, I know what I'll do. I'll sort this Iga province business out. Like you say, how hard can that possibly be? Right. Fortunately, it's quite hard. Otherwise, that'd be the end of our conversation, I guess.
It would be. Yeah, it'd be merely a footnote.
In terms of the Iki in particular in Iga, it's sort of a league, and they've expelled the senior samurai figure, but are there standout leaders for them, or is it very much a sort of collegiate effort?
The answer is no. I mean, we have the names of a couple of the senior leaders, if you will, but it really was more of a collective than any, hierarchical organization that we would associate with, like, there being a daimyo and samurai underneath him and so forth. That's not to say that there wasn't a hierarchy. There was, but it's really hard to just name one person as an acting figure on the Iga side of things. And part of this is because of the way that they constructed it. This is born out of sort of the chaos in the wake of the Onin War of 1467 to 1477. That's often seen as the beginning of the Sengoku age, the age of warring states, as we call it, where central authority underneath the Ashikaga shoguns is breaking down. They're losing their connections to the provinces and unable to control things. And so, when you have a time of chaos, in response to this, and as a way to limit internal conflict in their own ranks, in 1494, we see two documents that we can, they're not quite constitutions in the way that we would think of it, but they kind of form the rules for local life within Iga as a community. The first one is a document signed by 350 commoners. So, think about peasants, villagers, and so forth. And it's an agreement to abide by specific rules that limit conflict over, rice paddy land, access to forests, mountains, and fields, and it kind of gives a general code of conduct, right? So in the absence of authority coming from the center, they decide to create their own sort of rules for them to live by. And then later on that same year, we see another document signed by 46 people representing families of note from Iga province, and they're kind of like a class above the peasants and the commoners of the local area. So these 46 families sign an oath vowing not to fight over taxes or the collection thereof, to work together to prevent insubordination of the peasants underneath them. And essentially it's a cooperative to work together, much like the peasants of the province have agreed to. And these two groups form a united front in coordination to maintain local order and peace and limit the amount of violence, whether it's internal or whether it's coming from external sources like bandits or even larger warrior organizations like a daimyo, from a neighboring province who wants to move in. So there's no one person who holds absolute power. They don't elect a president or something like that. And I do want to be careful that it's easy to look at this and see, oh, is this a democracy? No, it's not, right? It's at least not in the modern sense of we think of it. There is a hierarchy. There are, the upper class, those 46 samurai families are in charge and so forth. But it is much more of a collectively driven organization than certainly the daimyo houses that we are normally associated with this period. So one of the things that's important to as you're visualizing kind of this province of Iga is it's ringed by mountains. It's very mountainous internally as well, but there's a ring of mountains around it that prevents easy access to it. It's very easily defensible. And there's 6 main passes through which, if you're going to bring an army, you have to go through one of those passes in order to get there. So it was much easier for the Iga Iki to keep outsiders out, similar organizations, which is why they lasted as long as they did. Because they're not really a threat to go outside of Iga. They're not going to invade the provinces around them and try to conquer territory. I mean, we could almost think of this, if we wanted to simplify things, as, this idyllic little, province full of villages of people minding their own business. It's not entirely true, of course. One of the things that the Iga warriors did was often hire themselves out as contractors to other entities, would be they temples or be they other, daimyo. You can kind of see where we have, this league of warriors and peasants that exists in kind of this quasi state of equality, but not really, but for the time, fairly egalitarian. And they are capable militarily. Many of them are experienced hunters and trackers through the mountains. They have, the kind of outdoor living skills we might attribute to commandos or something like that, right? Because they could be hired or requested to assist with campaigns elsewhere.
Right, so from Nobunaga's point of view, they're not a threat, but their existence is a continual offence to him that at some point he's going to want to deal with. Is there a catalyst that brings all of this tension to a head and actually causes him to go to war with them?
So, like I said, they expel the military governor, who really wasn't doing a whole bunch anyway, if we're honest. And Nobukatsu, Nobunaga's second son, takes that as an excuse of, oh, see, they're not observing the proper order of things. They're not part of the structure. So he decides of his own accord that he's going to expand his domain into Iga without permission from his father. And like I said, part of this is ego-driven. He wants to prove to his father that he can, operate on his own. So in 1578, he dispatches one of his generals, a man by the name of Takigawa Kazumasu, to build a castle just across the Iga border they're going to use as a staging point for a future invasion. Well, the warriors of Iga are alerted to this and realize what this means. So they decide to attack and destroy it, which they do in November of 1578. And Takigawa is taken completely by surprise. The castle is burned. Takigawa and his small force is forced to retreat. They obviously cease work on the castle, retreat back to Ise after, losing a second battle where they try to retake the ground. That is very quickly defeated and destroyed. And so, now Nobukatsu's somewhat embarrassed. He wants to avenge this, right? So the following year, in October, he decides he's going to launch a much larger invasion. So he gathers around, 10,000, a little over 10,000 men, and invades Iga province through 3 of those passes that I mentioned, through those narrow passes. He has, in his main body, he has 8,000 men going through the northernmost pass at Nagano. And then he has a group of 1,500 men through one pass and 1,300 through another pass, these 2 passes to the south. But again, the Iga forces, speaking to their ability to collect intelligence and know what the enemy is doing, are ready and waiting at these narrow sites to ambush Nobukatsu's forces, which they do. They use their skill in guerrilla tactics and their local knowledge of the terrain not fighting fair, because why would you? And they inflict heavy losses against Nobukatsu's forces, again forcing him to retreat in a humiliating defeat. And this is the one that really kind of sparks everything, because now this is too big to hide from Dad. He'd done all this. He hadn't asked his father. He wanted to prove himself. He actually does the opposite and shows himself to be, somewhat incompetent, at least in this endeavor. And Nobunaga is furious. So he supposedly threatens to disown Nobukatsu. He doesn't end up following through on it, but he's not pleased. He would be very happy to eliminate this kind of island of resistance inside his territory, but it's not a huge priority. So he's very upset that Nobukatsu did this without his, guidance, without, better planning, and that he failed at it, most importantly. But in 1581, he comes back and we have, the main invasion of the Tensho-Iga War.
Up until this point, it sounds a little bit like a teenager who's thrown a house party without his parents' knowledge and has done an awful lot of damage, and his dad's really, really annoyed about him. It's not the end of the world, but, everyone's not very happy about this. But then there is going to be a reckoning. And so when we get to the main events of the Tensho-Iga War, before we kick it off in 1581, it might sound like a silly question given the position that Nobunaga's in, but who should we consider as kind of the favourite or the underdog? Because you've painted a really nice picture of Iga as this incredibly defensible place with an incredibly capable population and very limited access to it. So for all of Nobunaga's power, can we consider him favourite in this fight, or do Iga have a really good chance?
That's an interesting question. Up front, I'll say that I don't think you could consider the Iga League the favorite at any point, right? We're just dealing with too much might. In 1581, Nobunaga is really at the height of his power. At this point, it's almost inevitable in many people's eyes that he's going to complete the conquest of Japan. Of course, we know that he doesn't, because he meets his untimely end at the hands of an assassination. But barring that, there's no reason why he wouldn't have continued to, continue his conquests, right? He's able to muster resources and manpower that are just on a scale that Iga clearly cannot compete with. That said, I do want to point out some advantages that the Iga Iki had. One is this long experience with kind of, unconventional warfare, we'll say, right? Another is that they're led by lower level warriors, localized power base holding warriors. But they integrate the civilian, as it were, population, the peasant population, the commoner population, if you will, into their organization. Often you'll hear people talk about the Iga shinobi clan or ninja clan or something like that. And that's misleading, because this wasn't a family-based organization in the way that we think of like the Oda being a military and political entity organized around the Oda family. That's not what this was, but they were able to conscript almost the members of the community from all levels, give them military training, and utilize them in ways that we don't necessarily see to the same extent in other locations. So it wasn't just these 46 families that signed the oath document saying that they would work together and their, household warriors. It was a mobilization of the entire community to resist external aggression. Unfortunately for them, at this point, armies had grown in size. They're not dealing with the same sorts of banditry threats or, smaller daimyo armies that they had in previous decades. Nobunaga can, at the snap of a finger, mobilize an army of 60,000, no problem. As much as we would like to romanticize some of the advantages and some of the things that the Iga collective was able to do, if Nobunaga was serious, there's no question that Nobunaga was going to be the favorite in this contest.
You said two words then that nearly made me squeak with excitement, and I've done my best to keep quiet while you were answering the rest of the question, but you used two words that I want to come back to.
Okay.
Because the Tensho-Iga War pits the samurai and Nobunaga and that way of fighting against the shinobi, also known as the ninja. Those are two very cool words that you just kind of glossed over. I need to come back to those words. What do we mean by shinobi and ninja?
Okay, so this is of course, the shiny object that everybody wants to gravitate to in this conversation.
Guilty.
And with good reason. I mean, you're right. There's the cool factor there, of course. So what we mean at this time, and the word ninja is a bit anachronistic, as some of your listeners may know, for this point. Shinobi is used at this time in certain ways. The two words are the same. In fact, they're based on the same Chinese kanji character, which can mean a variety of things, one of which is to sneak or to be unseen, right? So this is where we get the description of them as, masters of disguise, sneaking into castles and causing havoc and so forth. Even today, we in Japanese, you use the term shinobi komu to sneak in to somewhere. So that's where the word comes from. At the time, and many of these groups started out as either groups of bandits or groups of local, level jizamurai, warriors of the land, like I mentioned, in Iga, who didn't necessarily want to accept the authority and be absorbed into a daimyo's organizational system, but were more than willing to do dirty jobs for pay. All major daimyo had some sort of relationship with a group like this that they could contract out. As we talk about the Sengoku period and these different groups who rise up to become daimyo, this was one of the paths that one could take, was starting out as basically a military contractor for dirty jobs. And it's one way to describe sort of these special operations missions or roles that the Iga members, or just to the north of Iga is Omi province. And the district of Omi province that borders on Iga is known as Koka, right? So we have a group there that sort of formed their own league, much like we see in Iga. And that gives rise to these legends of the Koka ninja versus the Iga ninja. And that's not really accurate. I mean, there were times where they, did conflict, but there were also times where they cooperated with each other, recognized each other as kindred spirits, if you will, in terms of, maintaining independence and doing these sorts of contract jobs. One of the things that I do want to stress is, like you mentioned, that this pits our idea of samurai versus the shinobi or the ninja and whatever. And that's a false dichotomy because, like I mentioned, there were samurai, local samurai, who were participants and even the leaders of the Iga Iki, leading and training the peasants in how to do various types of warfare and guerrilla defense. It's more like conventional versus unconventional military sets, right? You have the army who does the let's go attack with tanks and seize territory and whatever. But then you have within the army, there are certain units who are trained in special operations and do, more of the sneaky, cool stuff that makes it into movies, right? And that, I think, is a better way to kind of frame the idea of what a shinobi is at this time. They're warriors. They could fight conventionally, and many of them did, but they would also have these additional skill sets that allowed them to do some special missions.
Yeah, so maybe we've slightly romanticized our visions of ninjas as all dressed in black with smoke bombs going off and assassinating everybody, but we should think of them perhaps as modern special forces, as, the UK's SAS, the American Navy SEALs, that kind of absolute pinnacle of military ability in guerrilla warfare. Yes, and doing, very similar things, whether it's a deep intelligence gathering in enemy terrain or extraction missions, or, sometimes taking out the enemy and so forth. So it's easy to frame it in this dichotomy of, there's the noble samurai who fights with his sword and whatever, and then the shinobi skulking around in the shadows, but it's not quite an accurate dichotomy. I hope we can still be friends, Nate, if I forget everything you've just told me and keep that romantic image in my head. I'm just gonna pretend I didn't hear all of that. Given that we've then pitched this war has begun, we understand that Nobunaga is going to be pretty much unstoppable once he focuses his mind on it, although he's going to meet some resistance. How does the war play out? And is there a key moment that determines the failure for one side or the other?
I hate to be reductive, and I hate to be unromantic, I guess I should say, in this, but really the key moment of failure is when Nobunaga decides to get serious and invade Iga with more of a plan than his son had. Even Nobukatsu's invasion only lasted a day before he was turned back. The second larger invasion of 1581 lasts 9 days. So unlike this, protracted guerrilla war that we might have in our minds, it was really a quick invasion by Nobunaga, quickly taking a couple castles, receiving their submission, and then moving on with, everybody moves on with their lives. So yeah, to go into like some of the details, Nobunaga invades at the end of September, on September 30th. Reports of the war say he had somewhere between 40,000 or 60,000 troops. And the fact that he owns all the territory surrounding Iga. And this means that the Iga Iki cannot concentrate their forces to prevent any of these invasions coming in from any one pass. Whereas, in 1579, they only defend 3 passes from one direction. Now it's 6 passes coming from all directions, including their neighbors to the north in Koka, specialists in guerrilla operations and warfare to advise and assist him. And this is probably where we get a lot of the imagery of this rivalry between Iga and Koka, because Koka did assist Nobunaga in his invasion. He also allegedly had some Iga members who offered to him to help show him through the passes and give him that advantage. So there may have been internal to Iga support for Nobunaga. Nobunaga invades on the 30th, as I said. He outnumbers the Iga defenders about 4 or 5 to 1. And the Iga defenders are spread across the province. They can't concentrate in one location. They end up being concentrated in 2 castles, one in the north, Hijiyama Castle, and one in the south, Kashiwara Castle. But it all ends with the surrender of Kashiwara Castle on October 8th. At that point, there's no more organized resistance to Nobunaga. It's overwhelming force. And he knows it. The Iga Iki know it. It's the end. And Nobunaga himself visits Iga in early November to take a tour of his new province, and then withdraws it and gives it to his son Nobukatsu as part of his domain to administer. So I apologize that it's anticlimactic almost.
That leads me to an interesting point, because it does sound so, as you say, anticlimactic, and it isn't this huge power struggle that goes on for a long time between 2 different ways of doing things. Yet we still remember it as a significant moment. The Tensho-Iga War is a thing that is remembered. Why does it have such a legacy? Why does it stand out in a period in Japanese history that is all about war and fracture and conquest? Why does this one stand out?
That's an excellent question, because you're absolutely right. From a military campaign standpoint, it's interesting that the first invasion is repelled in the way that it is. But the second invasion is not really all that remarkable. The reason I think it sticks with us is because of this image of resistance in an unconventional way. We have this image of guerrilla-style resistance by, well-trained, mountain-savvy, warriors of the shadows. And this largely comes to us because once Iga is conquered, if you didn't die in the campaign, what are you going to do? Well, now you have no homeland anymore. I mean, I suppose some people probably stayed and just served the daimyo that was placed on top of them. But many of them, chose to leave Iga and work as contract warriors for hire, right? So taking the skills they had become famous for and using those as a means to gain, both economic stability and legitimacy, find themselves employment. So, we hear stories about different men of Iga, right? Iga mono becomes almost like a synonym for shinobi, right? If you were to hire a man from Iga, everybody knew what you were hiring this person for. It was to do cloak and dagger dirty deeds, right? Many of them went to work for a retainer of Tokugawa Ieyasu who has become famous in kind of ninja lore, a man by the name of Hattori Hanzo. And Hattori Hanzo had family ties to Iga. He's often referred to or portrayed as in pop culture as a ninja, but he was a samurai retainer, a warrior, just like many of the warriors that fought for, any of the daimyo of this period. But because through his family ties, he had a knowledge base of these sort of unconventional guerrilla tactics, right? He also had, through those ties, the ability to kind of act as a landing place for many of these men of Iga. And so many of them went to work for Tokugawa Ieyasu under the command of Hattori Hanzo. And so a lot of our notions of, these later notions of the ninja as, black clad, sneaking around castles at night and so forth come from when the men of Iga spread out and became these contract warriors hired to do these sorts of clandestine jobs. And that fact that many of them worked for what would eventually become the leader of all Japan in Tokugawa Ieyasu. There's actually a gate of what is now the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, but underneath the Tokugawa shoguns was the Shogun's Palace, the Shogun's Castle. One of the gates is named the Hanzo Mon, the Gate of Hanzo, the Hanzo Gate. And this is because, Hattori Hanzo and the men of Iga that he recruited acted as a special guard force for the Tokugawa shoguns. And so, here you have these men who are trained in sneaking into castles, assassination, espionage. Well, who better to defend against that sort of thing than people who are trained how to do it?
Fascinating. So Iga as a province fell, but the idea of Iga continued and flourished in other ways and in other places. And I mean, it's been fascinating to talk through this episode, and just to get to talk about Hattori Hanzo, shinobi, ninja has been absolutely cool. I'm busy forgetting some of the things that you told me that I didn't want to hear, but I'm remembering all of the rest of it. So thank you very, very much for joining us again, Nate, and for going through the details of the Tensho-Iga War for us. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely a pleasure. And thank you again for having me.
Thanks for watching Echoes of History. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the real history behind the Assassin's Creed games, then subscribe for more episodes. You can check out the extended interviews wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description. You should also hit the links that are floating on the screen somewhere. Are they on my face? They're on my face again, aren't they? Get them off. Follow a link, please.